was going to pretend that it was a different day and a different time, but forget it. I'm doing these two videos in the exact same moment. This is an important video because it's something that's close to my heart, to some of my own research in narrative theory. So my specialty many years ago was narrative theory, but then within narrative theory I talked a lot about narrative levels for one thing, but also the borders of narrative and what narrative does when it breaks apart. And I want to talk about a few examples. And one thing is when narratives do different things with time. So, for example, we have something like a circular narrative. You might have read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and you're reading and the story takes place, and when you get to the end you realize that this character is writing the book that we've just read, and the last sentence echoes the first sentence of the work, and we seem to have a circular narrative. Of course, we don't literally have a circular narrative because we've just read from the beginning to the end, but in some sense we're brought back at least to the beginning of the story, so the narrative is circular. Another example might be a backward narrative, and this becomes more interesting. Now again, I don't think we can ever really have a backward narrative. Otherwise, you know, and the reason I think is because language is linear and language is unidirectional. So if we really had a backward narrative, it would be something like this. Sorry. So, but there have been a lot of people who have experimented with backward narratives. For example, and I took notes on this one, we have Betrayal, the play by Harold Pinter, the story of an affair and a divorce, the breakup of a relationship, and we start in the final moment, and then scene by scene by scene we work our way back, and it's very effective for examining how something quite sadly falls apart, and it's so nice that we end on this wonderful meeting of the characters. But again, each scene is linear and each scene goes forward, even though the scenes themselves go backwards. Another great example is the movie Memento. The detective wakes up to find out that he has lost his memory, and he loses his memory at the end of every day, so he has to write things on him, and we slowly work our way as the narrator works his way, or the main character works his way back to find out what happened to him in the first place, so the narrative moves backwards. That's a great example. Martin Amis wrote the novel Time's Arrow. Time's Arrow is another, probably the best example of backward narrative that's out there, a great fun novel to read. There are other ways of breaking the barriers and or changing what narrative does. And probably one of the best examples was hypertext, and that's what you're going to read about in one of the readings. And hypertext is essentially set up like a website. So in other words, you're reading a piece of the story, and then you click on it, and it takes you to another part of the story, and you can click on various words. So everybody who reads it has a different reading of this text. It is broken up. It is what Roland Barthes calls a readerly text, in that we're putting so much of the meaning into it and not the author. And this is really taking apart what we normally think of as narrative. It plays with time, it plays with order, it plays with what comes next, it plays with causality, it plays with the idea that an author and a narrator are in control of a story. The funny thing is hypertext narrative largely failed, partly because people were frustrated at not having a story, that somehow these hypertext narratives were losing narrativity. What I think, however, is that first of all, hypertext narrative wasn't that new, that there are certain novels that did what hypertext was trying to do, and did it maybe in a better way. And then I think also that hypertext really, in a way, hypertext fiction turned into the internet. And the type of reading that we do on the internet, which is linear for a time on a page, but which can be connective, networked, and take us off in other directions, that kind of reading has influenced the way we approach, or I was going to say approach print fiction, but perhaps it's influenced the way we're producing print fiction. That print fiction itself is more networked, connected, broken, not in our usual time order, because we're used to reading not in the usual time order from things from the internet. But let me tell you a little bit about the precursors to hypertext. I think it's very interesting to look at a book like Mark Saporta's Composition No. 1. It was originally published in French, and maybe 1960, could be a little bit earlier, but this is a novel that came in a box and it's printed on individual pages. I saw the original in a rare book library, and now you can buy it as an app, which is unbelievable. But you take this book, composition number 1, comes in a box, and the instructions on the front cover are throw the pages on the ground, pick them up, and that's the novel that you're going to read. So everybody's having a different experience of this reading. If we want to talk about another print version of hypertext narrative, all you have to do is think of choose your own ending stories. The only problem with choose your own ending stories is that they're relatively limited. There aren't that many choices, but essentially they're trying to do what some of the experimental people were doing in the 1960s with fiction in a print page, and that the hypertext people then took to an extreme a little bit later. Another great example is Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar. It is essentially, it's 2 texts intertwined, at the beginning you have different options. You can read it in this order, chapter 1, chapter 9, chapter 30, chapter 50, or you can read it in this order, and it gives you another suggestion for chapters, or you can read it backward. So you have all these different possible reading orders to Hopscotch. Fantastic novel, plays with jazz and rhythms and progressions, and the story does and the text is as well, because you're reading it in different orders, thus getting different rhythms to the story. I guess the question is, or the concern is, that all of these are trying to experiment with narrative, they all strain narrativity, because so many of these are difficult to read because we want causality, we want order, we want to understand, have an idea of something going to happen next. We want to read something and say, aha, this is significant, I can't wait to find out what happens. And now, oh, I get why that happened, or I understand this character. I think that some contemporary print texts are playing with this in interesting ways. There's a great novel called House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. It's a very complicated plot. I can't explain it here, but it's worth looking up. But you're taken to footnotes. At times, text is running upside down, backwards. There's a part where you're supposed to be reading something that's in a box, and it looks like a black box going through a number of pages. And this is obviously influenced by some of these early postmodern texts, but it's also obviously influenced by hypertext, and it's influenced by other media and the way we're used to manipulating things. Some interesting theorists. You have Janet Murray writing Hamlet on the Holodeck. You have Espen Aarseth writing cybertext, texts that force us to manipulate our way through them. N. Catherine Hales has written great books. It's worth picking up. Writing Machines, which is very small, very accessible. It's about her own career, and it's about how to read texts that ask us to make these momentous changes as we go through. Anything by Marie-Laure Ryan is great to read on this. I think that these experiments are interesting because they're not only changing order and asking us to move throughout a text, but they're also doing interesting things with images. So we have the development of the graphic novel, for example. Many graphic novels are very simply linear, but then you have other experimenters like Chris Ware writing graphic novels which clearly not only deal with the graphic novel and images, but it's also dealing with how images are networked, how images are spread on a page, how a reader might approach the graphic novel in different orders. Would tend to be linear in a graphic novel, but there are certain pages in a Chris Ware novel where we're not sure what to read first, that we are actually presented with almost a map of a network. Very interesting. You also have other texts that experiment with images that I think go way back even before the graphic novel and also strain the borders of narrative. You could look at things like Take It or Leave It by Raymond Federman, where complete pages say things like noodles, 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 or another page is concrete poem. It's obviously playing with the way we work our way through a text, and obviously playing too with what we consider text. Is it just writing, or can it be writing in images? You also see images, though, in Faulkner. In As I Lay Dying, there's a small sketch of a coffin. Or you go way back and go to William Blake in his poems, originally published with images. I I know we could go back to illuminated versions of the Bible, but I think that's a little bit different in that we have a text that's decorated, whereas Blake published his poems with the images, and he was an artist and they were meant to go with the poems. So to a certain extent, when we're not reading the poems that way, we're not reading them the way they're meant to be read. I think, interestingly, we could go back to handwritten poems by Emily Dickinson. So many of her poems weren't published. The ones that were published were phenomenally changed during the printing process, and phenomenally changed by her editors, and she complained that she didn't like some of the poems that were published. But if you go to Emily Dickinson's original poems, there are so many gaps and ellipses, and sometimes there's a large gap between stanzas, and sometimes there isn't, and it's very clear reading those poems that that layout on the page matters, that the size of her handwriting matters. Now, I'm not trying to be an advocate for handwriting here. What I am trying to be an advocate, however, are those borders of narrative and how they can affect the story that we're reading, and how our typical notion of a story going from point A to point B to point C, of having a nice Freytag's pyramid with rising action, climax, denouement, the whole business, that's not necessarily in a narrative. But that when we are adding these other elements, we are questioning narrative and perhaps straining narrative. And some of these, I think, work. Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves clearly works. Hopscotch works, though it's difficult. But sometimes I think perhaps we strain narrative too far, maybe as I have in this video. I think it's really a fascinating conversation. I think it's a fascinating area of research. In fact, if we start talking a little bit more about narrative in other media, this is a massive area for research today in narrative theory. So looking at what are the theories behind narrative on hypertext or on the computer? What are the theories of narrative in image or narrative in the graphic novel? The graphic novel manages to combine elements of film, elements of art, elements of traditional comic book use, and print narrative, and puts them all together in interesting ways and sort of strains at the definition of narrative. In the case of graphic novels, I don't think they strain at narrativity at all, but they perhaps strain our theories for narrative. There's a lot of work being done on images, there's a lot of work being done on digital media and narrative, among other things. I think it's a fruitful area of research, a very interesting thing to me, and I hope you enjoy continuing to explore the borders of narrative. And I think that some of these, the reason to study the borders is to understand the core, I think, but also there are ways in which Bender pushes at the borders in a traditional print text, and certainly Charles Yu pushes at the borders. I think we're going to find, if we manage to read, we're going to have to talk about that, The Known World, which is a very big novel, that's not straining the borders perhaps in the same way of narrative, but I think that in a tricky way it is straining the borders. It's straining perhaps ontological borders. And it does play with literal borders, but we can get to that later. Thanks.